Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a lot to cover this evening. My name is Christopher Cook, and welcome to the first Conversations from the Edge. And I really want to thank Sarah Dunning and the Westmoreland Group family for helping us make this happen. And we'll tell you more about what we're aiming to do. So as we sit here this evening, we're on the edge of the Lake District National Park, we're on the edge of England, we're on the edge of Scotland, and according to Dave, our cameraman, the other edge that we need to refer to here is that you won't be able to send tweets from the auditorium. We're on the edge of the mobile phone signals in this area, so we won't be able to tweet and Twitter. But in terms of this evening, Walter's going to speak for the first hour, and then we'll take a 20-minute break, so we're going to have a conventional break in the evening, and the bar will be open, there's water and so on as well, and we'll just take a 20-minute break. It's also a chance for you just to sign up for our newsletter, and we're going to raffle at one of Walter's DVDs that I filmed with him back in 2009. It's now becoming a collector's item, and I think I've got 3 left, so we're going to do a little raffle tonight to support that transition into the second half. And I'm going to read the next bit, because I only wrote it this morning and it's important. Conversations from the Edge is really a celebration of humanness. Over the last 120,000 years, we've clearly emerged as a species with curiosity, capacities for curiosity, innovation and change. And at that point, I just want to thank you all for being here. I know some of you have come a great distance to be here this evening, and we're very grateful for you being here. It wouldn't be an event without you. And if we look at the effort you've taken this evening, and the number of people that told me they're on holiday this evening couldn't be here, I want to just let you know that history tells us that civilizations always change from the edge. So you're on the edge. And it takes many years before the new normal emerges. Now, unfortunately, if you look at history as well, we'll learn that the edge workers are often initially described as heroes, heretics, and upstarts. So that was the bit I was waiting to tell you, Walter. Because this evening we've got Walter Jehne, and he's from the other edge of the planet, he's from Australia, and he's going to offer us some fresh ideas about how we open our minds to the reality that the answer to many of our challenges lay beneath our feet. Now I'm going to leave it to you, the audience, to decide whether he is a hero, heretic or upstart. And over to you, Walter.
Right, can everyone hear me? Yes. Sorry? Is that on now? Yep, good. Well, look, thank you very, very much for having me here. It's wonderful to be here in Cumbria. And yeah, for all you people having travelled for a long way, me too. I come from Australia, and I've been on actually an extended workshop tour, basically in Middle East, then through England, US, Canada, Sweden, now back in England. Hope to go home actually next week. But the point is, it's really wonderful to be here, talking with you, listening, hearing what your side of the picture is, and then just, brainstorming the options and outlining what are the journeys that we can do. As Christopher mentioned, it's very much that edge, it's very much the innovation, but it's also very much that grassroots community empowerment and activity, because that's where the innovations come from. By definition, not the status quo. And so be brave, because it's that innovation and those creative new ideas and taking those ideas forward, critically testing them, always challenging, but the point is taking those ideas forward. And it's really, that's what we want to do today. We just want to explore some new, quite different ideas, and then just see to what extent does that open doors for the future, options for us to say, look, we can manage this, we can go forward. Can we get out of some of the black holes that we've created for ourselves, where we're saying, hey, it's just too difficult, too hard? Are there natural solutions? That's the other thing that we want to really make a point of here. All we're going to talk about is absolutely verified in nature. If you sort of say, look, okay, well, how does nature function? Can we understand that? Then there are elegant, simple, practical solutions from that. And so all we've talked about is, okay, well, what does nature do in these circumstances? How did nature create these systems? How does nature naturally regenerate these systems? And then, of course, can we also learn from nature, and can we use those to introduce that? Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. Right. Okay, so that's the big picture, and then just a bit of background introduction to myself. I'm a soil microbiologist. I worked for a long time with our premier CSIRO, our research organisation in Australia, government in forestry, tropical crops and pastures, soil, land regeneration. Obviously Australia is a very large continent, the driest inhabited continent, fairly harsh land, but on the other hand 95% of Australia is still vegetated. So life has sort of dominated, has prospered, has evolved over 46 million years to create very resilient, very productive and very, very, very clever biosystems. And so really what we want to bring into this debate is, yes, some of that resilience, some of that intelligence, that cleverness of 46 million years of natural selection, evolution in terms of problem solving. I worked also for a long time in our government, strategically looking at innovation and what do we need to do to actually take that R&D, that innovation, and bring it into the marketplace. And that's still relevant to us here as well, because we've got all these innovative farmers, communities, activists, but really it's how do we make that innovation real? You know, how do we build the commercial potential from that innovation and take it forward? And so that's, again, a very important lesson, because there's no point just having good ideas or just research. It's a question of how do we empower the grassroots, the community, to take these innovations forward and make the change. Partly in that context, 15 years ago I retired. I'm pretty old, and basically we formed this NGO, non-government organisation called Healthy Soils Australia. And they're a network of very innovative groups of farmers. It's not a big formal structure, but we work with about 1,000 very innovative leading farmers, community activists. And these are, in a sense, driving some very clever, natural regeneration strategies. And in a sense, that's the base where we started from. And of course, progressively, this has got global. We then are networked with a whole lot of people internationally. And of course, that's what I've been doing, in a sense, getting drawn into that international workshop discussion with that wider audience. But the good news is there's a very extensive, very genuine, powerful, grassroots uprising, farmer groups, community groups everywhere saying, look, we need to take direct action, practical action to make the changes that are needed. And so that's extremely effective. Just to mention again context, I also work very closely with Mr. Major General Michael Jeffrey. He's our ex-Governor General in Australia. And basically Michael retired slightly after us. I did, and then basically we've been working very closely with Michael in terms of the scientific, the strategic backup, because Michael is, in a sense, was appointed our national advocate of soil health Australia-wide, and really with Michael we've been driving a lot of the political agenda. And again, the good news is, whether it's in Australia, you know, all levels of politics, there's no argument about what we talk about. It's totally accepted. Similarly, whether it's the World Bank, whether it's the UN, whether it's the major strategic defence agencies, they all get it. You know, they all understand, look, it's water, it's food, it's habitat, it's social stability. It's avoiding the serious, and when you bring it all back down to it, the only way humanity is going to do this is through regeneration of our soils, building resilience. Okay? And so today, that's really what I wanted to focus on. Just a quick rundown of what I'd like to talk about, but basically very simple, is this whole concept of resilience. You know, what it is that we need to do to build resilience. And really, resilience, when you break it all down, is about regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge. Now, these are very deliberate words, but basically we want to talk about this whole concept of a sponge, soil, and why that's so important. In a sense, it's how nature created this terrestrial biosystem. It's now nature manages and buffers and regulates the Earth's hydrology. It's how nature regulates the Earth's climate. Quite provocative concepts and statements, but let's go and explore that. And we want to see really why, what, and how we can do that, but then also what are some of the benefits, the dividends that would flow potentially to you people doing it, and then really where does that stand with revitalising, re-empowering regions, both at a farmer level, on farm, but also then at a community, social, rural revitalisation basis. So look, that's what I wanted to talk about. Throughout the talk, I'm happy to have discussions, points of clarification, but as Christopher said, we're going to have then a short break, and then let's have that really deep Q&A, question and answer, interrogation. We've got all these whiteboards here. That's for you to throw tomatoes at me, and I'll stand here in the middle, and you can throw things at me, and I can have to duck, but I can't see what you're throwing, so I'm not going to be able to duck very much. But they're really just to try and draw some of the pictures, some of the sort of concepts that we're talking about. Okay, so if we want to start in this game, it's about resilience, you see, and it's about really facing reality. And the reality was made very clear about 50 years ago. Hey, this is fantastic, Christopher. Look at this. I like drawing on whiteboards. He said, look, hey, you've got to do better than whiteboards. We can actually sort of give you, these big profiles. And so here I go. And okay, the reality was given us 50 years ago by Charles Keeling. And of course, this is carbon dioxide, and this is time. Okay, and basically he more or less sort of put the evidence. It's not the first person who'd done that. Cervantes Arrhenius had done that, Fourier before in the 1830s, but basically said, look, CO2 is going up. It's 406 parts per million now, and so we've got this abnormal rise in CO2. This was about 50 years ago when that first data came. And so in a sense, the answer we have here a symptom, CO2 rising. And of course, this gave rise to a lot of questions. Well, why was this happening? And what are its consequences? Because we know that CO2 is a component of the greenhouse effect. It's one of the minor, but it's one of the greenhouse gases. So that was a question. Okay, here is this symptom. Here's CO2 rising. And so we have a reality that, hey, we have disturbed something fundamental in this planet. Okay, we have really changed something, that we have a system that had been stable, and we've got this abnormal CO2 increase. And of course, that caused 40 years ago President Carter, to actually issue a brief to the Scripps Oceanographic Institute at San Diego and Los Alamos to say, well, look, here is this abnormal CO2 rise, what's causing it, what are its potential risks and consequences, specifically for the US, and can you give me a risk analysis? Can you model, what the risks or the potential impacts of this CO2 rise or the global warming from it are going to be, particularly to the US? And of course, they sort of looked at that and sort of said, right, in terms of this brief, it's pretty profound, but how do we do it? Now, they'd all recognized, all climatology 101 recognizes that in a sense, it's water that governs 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet. Okay, again, a fundamental basis of climatology. It's actually the hydrology of the planet for the last 4 billion years that has regulated 95% of its heat dynamics. But water is quite a problem because basically it is so variable in time and space, and it is so dominant that how does this relate to this CO2 rise? And so they had to make the assumption, not necessarily wisely, that look, water is such a dominant factor in governing, regulating the Earth's climate that humans could not possibly have altered it. It was also impossible to model it mathematically because it was so variable in time and space. Okay, and so they took the brief to say, look, okay, let us look at the CO2 greenhouse effect and look at that connection and then sort of say, what are the risks? And they did that very astutely and basically came back with a report to the President 2000 that went to Ronald Reagan and concluded, yes, the CO2 greenhouse effect is real. Yes, there will be about a 0.2, 0.3 degree centigrade rise by a doubling of CO2, less than the 0.8, 1 degree centigrade we're now recording. We'll come to that. But basically, it wouldn't be a major catastrophic problem because if anything in the US, particularly the northern Corn Belt, the northern agricultural areas into Canada, it would actually extend productivities, it might increase rainfall, and therefore it was actually a fairly benign factor. And so really that's how we looked at that CO2 greenhouse situation back then from that Jimmy Carter analysis. Okay, and so really that's how we then sort of looked at it. We then went on after that, the last 30 years, through the IPCC, or prior to that the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, and basically sort of said, okay, let us now monitor this CO2 rise and let's see what the long-term scenarios and consequences are. You know, what are going to be the impacts, when, where, how, to what extent, and can we model that? And of course we've spent 30 years, some 60 billion US, on actually saying, okay, how do we forward project these CO2 rises and how do we forward project these climate change, global warming consequences. Okay, and so that is in a sense where the world is at, and really we've come to that position. In 2015, 3 years ago, at COP21, in a sense 195 and 197 nations involved agreed that, right, we need to sort of come down to a zero net carbon emissions strategy, because clearly this rise was abnormal and we have to sort of, in a sense, try to address that rise in CO2. Charles Keeling, way back in 1958, had also shown us some very powerful evidence that, in a sense, was really the profound basis of explaining what was going on. Because every year, this rise was made up of, in a sense, emissions. We were releasing CO2 largely in winter through our carbon emissions, and every year there was drawdown. The spring, summertime extension of green vegetation, of course, was drawing down carbon from the air through photosynthesis, but every year there was, in a sense, a deficit of some 10 billion tonnes of carbon per annum, which is, in a sense, the deficit of carbon that basically the Earth was experiencing, and that was why CO2 was going up. And so the issue became really in 2015, how do we balance our emissions with our drawdown? And in a sense, that's really the new challenge, or that's the new challenge up to 2015. If we look at the different factors that are contributing, fossil fuels emit about 8 billion tonnes of carbon per annum. Okay? But overall, we have emissions through all of the emissions of some 130 billion tonnes of carbon per annum every year. And we have a drawdown of some 120 billion tonnes of carbon per annum. Okay? And it's that 10 billion tonnes difference which is, in a sense, a deficit. And when we look at that reality, it's quite clear that there's no way that basically, even if we stopped all fossil fuels emissions, we would be able to offset that 10 billion tonnes deficit. But also, of course, we can't stop all fossil fuels emission because there's 7.4 billion of us on the planet at the moment, and we don't have 6 billion volunteers who say, look, I want to terminate life to get back to a non-fossil fuel future, because we're so dependent on fossil fuel for our whole industrial ecology. Okay, so we've got this challenge of how do we get to the drawdown of 10 billion tonnes of carbon, or getting this deficit down. Sure, we've always got to reduce our emission. Of course, we're not saying that we don't have to reduce our emissions, that's critical. But also, what is it that we can do on these two other aspects of the equation? Can we actually reduce the emissions that we don't account for? Because all our IPCC work has focused on these anthropogenic, these assumed human emissions. All these other ones we've always externalized to nature. We've always sort of said, look, Mother Nature is looking after those. They're not human, they're on her account. And vice versa with the actual drawdown, we're saying, all right, that drawdown is green photosynthesis by nature. Okay, what it is, can we extend those? So our job is, yes, can we draw down emissions 10 billion tonnes? And can we do that not just through fossil fuel reductions, but can we also work on reducing these emissions and perhaps increasing the drawdown of carbon? And that's become even more critical because when you think about it, we don't just have to draw down 10 billion tonnes of carbon, because all that would do is actually flatline this curve. It would keep CO2 actually at the level we are at now. If we want to return CO2 back to previous level, we actually have to decrease the amount of CO2, which means that we have to draw down another, just say 10 billion tonnes of carbon per annum to actually get CO2 coming down. So collectively, we might need to do 20 billion tonnes of carbon per annum. So that really becomes the big challenge of this 2015 zero net emissions target that the UN or the globe has set itself. And so we fully support that. The beautiful thing is, yes, we can. We can draw down 20 billion tonnes of carbon per annum. It's a bit audacious, appreciate that. But yes, we can, because if we look at these other sides of the equation, there's very, very elegant ways of doing that. Very simple, practical, efficient ways of doing it that nature does. What we have done up to now, we haven't recognised just where all these emissions are coming from in nature. Every year we burn, or we let burn, some 350 million hectares of forest. And in doing so, we let 10 to 100 tonnes of carbon per hectare burn. And so there's vast quantities of emissions going up from that. And of course, there's a massive capacity to reduce those fires through proper land management. Okay, so we can actually reduce very significantly the area of forest, the amount of carbon that is emitted from that burning. Every year, some 2 billion hectares of grasslands similarly burn, and they emit from 2 to 5 tonnes of carbon emissions per hectare. So again, every year there's a massive capacity to reduce these natural emissions. And this is really the paradigm change that we're now coming to, because up to now we've only looked at this fossil fuel or these anthropogenic human-caused emissions, and we've externalized everything else to nature. We've said, nature, hey, you can take responsibility for those. And of course the answer is we are responsible for those fire emissions, because our management of the landscape directly affects the risk of those fires, the intensity of those fires, and the amount of carbon they emit. Okay? And so the powerful positive message is, yes, by taking responsibility for these fires, can we actually reduce at least 10 billion tonnes of extra carbon from those emissions. The same goes on the drawdown equation. Every year, the residual green biosystems of this planet draw down that 120 billion tonnes of carbon. But those residual biosystems represent 50% of the biosystems that existed on this planet 6,000–7,000 years ago. Vast areas of this planet, whether it's inland Australia, whether it was the Sahara, whether it was the Middle East, were vegetated, were savannas 6,000–7,000 years ago. Okay, Libya was a savanna. The Romans got all the wild animals from the Colosseum from Libya. Libya now is effectively a desert. You see, so we have vastly changed the Earth's biosystems. And the question is, if we can regenerate some of those biosystems, can we bring this 120 billion tons back? And can we increase that 10, 20 billion tons? So we're saying we have this target of 20 billion tons carbon drawdown. And the answer is, how do we achieve that? How do we get into negative emissions using that 20 billion tons carbon? And can we use this reduction of fire and the regeneration of landscapes to do that? And so in a sense, the big message of our regeneration is very much, can we actually bring that carbon from the air back into the soils to rebuild that CO2 balance? But we have now another bigger problem. In 2005, there was a major conference in the Hadley Centre here in the UK, and really it sort of put together the picture that in fact, rather than these CO2 scenarios that the UNFCCC, IPCC have been modelling and documenting, and where they were projecting extremes to 2100, in fact, we were already accelerating and experiencing dangerous climate extremes. These extremes were intensifying, and they were already impacting seriously, and they involved, hurricanes, storms, floods, aridification, droughts, wildfires. And these were happening all over the planet in systemic, intensified ways in some regions, less so in other areas. And significantly, all these extremes are hydrological. So we were experiencing these dangerous hydrological extremes. And so now the question was, okay, what is it that we can do? What is it that we must do to try and avoid these extremes? How do we actually buffer those extremes? How do we avoid them? And how do we actually survive them? And so the whole climate change debate became actually much more about this issue of dangerous climate extremes. Okay, and really this becomes a critical point now, because we've been delaying perhaps for 30, 40 years on facing that reality Charles Keeling gave us. And we are now facing this world where things are, even here in Cumbria, getting unreliable climate patterns, increasing intensity storms, increasing periods of droughts, and then we're affecting that, hey, these are already affecting our water, our food, our habitats, their brittleness, and their capacity to function as they should, and we've expected them. And so this is really a big point now. What are we doing about these dangerous climate extremes? And that really comes to the point of our focus here. See, this is the background. This is why this is so important. We're talking about why, but the real issue is resilience, right? How do we rebuild the resilience of biosystems against these dangerous climate extremes? The other reason why we must do that is, again, fairly profound. Even if we draw down 20 billion tons of carbon every year through these practical, feasible options, basically for every ton of carbon we draw down, the ocean will say to humanity, thank you. Because the oceans of the world contain 30,000 billion tons of carbon dissolved in that seawater as a massive buffer. And as we draw down carbon from the air, the oceans will re-equilibrate carbon from its sink back into the atmosphere. And so it may take 100 to 1,000 years for us to get this carbon going back down to stop the CO2 component of the greenhouse effect we're so worried about. Okay? And it's that time that we don't have, because these dangerous climate extremes are already intensifying now, and as we're seeing in Syria and those sorts of places, you know, a lot of the Mediterranean regions, California, Western Australia, things are drying out, things are getting very precarious. And so the aridification of these regions, the collapse of biosystems, the collapse of societies are really already impacting now. So we have a bigger issue now than just drawing down carbon. We have to build resilience. And again, this is why we have to come to a whole new dimension. We have to rebuild the sponge. Okay? Because as we said in the beginning, it is water that governs 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet. And while we've ignored that hydrological process so far in our whole analysis of climate, it is actually water that provides the only safe natural means we now have for, in a sense, avoiding these dangerous climate extremes, but also naturally, safely cooling the climate. But this is, again, quite a radical new concept. Can we naturally, safely cool regions and the planet? Nature does it all around us all the time. Can we look at those natural processes? How do we, in a sense, understand them? And then can we actually use those processes to do that ourselves? Okay, so that's why the sponge, because obviously to have those natural hydrological cooling potentials, to have the potential for having this resilience, we need water in our soils. So let us explain what that whole process is, right? Let's just look at what that is. So basically, if we start off before there was life on land, 420 million years ago, the planet was just oceans and rock, okay? And basically there was complex life in the oceans that had come up through the Cambrian explosion, you know, the whole explosions of eukaryotic cells and multicellular organisms, but basically there was no life on land. It was just dry, arid, hard rock. But the life in the oceans depended on, obviously, nutrients leaching from that rock, because it's nutrients that were limiting that ocean ecology. And what happened was that basically 420 million years ago, fungi grew from the estuarine edges onto that rock to try and solubilize nutrients from that rock. Okay, so we had this sort of situation of the ocean, the rock, and we had sort of fungi growing up onto the rock to solubilize nutrients to feed life. And so these fungi, as they grew up onto the rock to solubilize these nutrients, left behind organic detritus. And that organic detritus actually then created soil organic matter. Okay, so we were talking about these fungi basically having colonized that dry rock and basically solubilizing nutrients. But of course, these fungi are like us. They effectively, you know, protoplasm in hyphal tubes, mycelial tubes, and they're really no different from us biochemically. Effectively, nothing is closer to animals than these fungi biochemically. And like us, these fungi can't photosynthesize carbon. Only plants can photosynthesize carbon. So what these fungi did, and we can do this in green, they basically picked up some friends. In Australia we call them mates. Blue-green algae from the oceans, and they formed a symbiosis with these blue-green algae, and in a sense we see those everywhere. They're the lichens, okay? The lichens, the symbiosis of fungi and algae that are all over the rocks, you know, as you walked into the foyer. They're rotting down logs, they're rotting the fender off your car, they're rotting your houses, they're biodegrading. And their balance, you see, everything that grows also biodegrades. And these lichens are the organisms so powerfully driving biodegradation. But basically, when you form this symbiosis of fungi and lichen, you had fungi and plant, and now it could go AWOL. It could go independently on that rock. It didn't have to be dependent on that ocean anymore. And so you had independent growing life forms on that planet. But as it grew and very rapidly evolved from lichens to mosses to liverworts to cycads to gymnosperms to angiosperms and 50 million years ago grasses, and as it colonized the whole of the 13 billion hectares of rock on this planet, those lichens were putting carbon into the soil. Okay, they were putting organic matter detritus into the soil. And how that worked was like this. You see, you had then the lichens, and they created the same 7, we got 7 particles. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 particles. But they basically put carbon detritus between these particles. Okay? And we draw them as little bed springs because that sort of makes the sponge sound a little bit easier to get the message across. But basically what happened from basically a solid rock, we ended up with a spongy matrix mixture of mineral particles and organic detritus. It was only 2 to 3% carbon that had to be added to these soils from this organic detritus, but it made a profound effect because this rock or this solid material has a bulk density of 2.6 to 3.5 grams per cc. That's just the weight per unit volume, whereas a sponge has a bulk density of 1.2 grams per c or less, which means that 60% of this matrix now is actually made up of nothing, of space, of voids. And in a sense, what nature created by adding this carbon to the soil is just creating a sponge, which was a healthy soil, by adding just space into that soil. Okay, as we get from these differences in this data. But that adding of space had a profound effect on the functions of this soil. Because, if we basically put a raindrop onto this material here, and I haven't given enough room, what happens to it? It basically runs off. Okay? And we end up with a flood. We end up with erosion, and we lose that water. We still have an arid rock landscape. But if we put that same raindrop onto this sponge, what happens to it? See, it basically infiltrates these voids, these spaces. Okay? And so the capacity changes functionally enormously because that sponge now can basically infiltrate, retain, and make available water. And with that, you profoundly increase the productivity of that spongy soil. Okay? You can have in-soil reservoirs, soils that are basically meters deep. I mean, if you look at the glaciated soils that grew over the last 9,000 years in North America after the ice retreated, and it's no time at all geologically, 10-meter deep organic sponges holding up to 3-4 meters of moisture in their profile as in-soil reservoirs. I mean, not all soils are that richly endowed with either space, voids and carbon, but the point of the capacity of the soils to hold water, and so the resilience of those soils is profound, because that is really what then buffers floods, extremes, etc., right? Because of these spaces, these voids in the soil, we also profoundly change the biofertility of those soils. When we were in this stage, sure, this is all mineral particles, whether it's phosphorus, zinc, selenium, But all those mineral particles were, in a sense, tightly held together, and those nutrients were unavailable. But once we create this open voids, all these nutrients become available on soil surfaces. Okay? And so then the biofertility, the availability of those nutrients, increases massively. 80% more of the productivity and fertility of soils is not related to their mineral content in total, or how many fertilizers we put on them, but on the availability of these natural minerals in the soil, the availability, exposure of those surfaces to the microbial life that exists in the soil. And of course, that's the other thing that we say, once we create these voids, we vastly increase the biological surface area and life in those soils. 10 times the weight, the biomass of living microorganisms in a healthy soil compared to the organisms living above the soil surface. Profound populations and activities of microbial activity. By creating these sponges, these voids, we also massively increase the rootability, the capacity for roots to proliferate into and throughout those soils. And instead of then having soils, as many of you are trying to farm, which might have roots down to 10, 15 centimeters, 6 inches, we have roots going down 10 meters. In our deserts in Australia, there's sandy soils, sure, we have roots down to 50 meters. Okay, and so the volume of soil resource for nutrients and water that these plant systems are able to draw on for their resilience is profoundly increased. Okay, and so basically, as we sort of said, right, we need to build this resilience. How did nature do it? She basically put organic matter into the soil to rebuild these soil carbon sponges, and in a sense, through building those soil carbon sponges, created the hydrology of those soils, the nutrition of the soils, the rootability of the soils, the microbial ecology of the soils, and really governed and enhanced the productivity. And that's how she was able to expand life across the planet, how she was able to rapidly evolve ever more productive biosystems across that whole land surface, how she was able to draw down not just 120 billion tons of carbon, but from what we know, 10,000, 8,000 years ago, probably twice that. Okay, so the capacity for carbon drawdown, and the point is it's only really modest amounts of carbon that was drawn down that creates these sponges. We see them very much as not the amount of carbon that's important, but the actual structural matrices that the carbon actually produces in the soil. We see them as actually cathedrals of space within that soil matrix. So a healthy soil isn't about what the minerals are. Just as a cathedral isn't about what the stones are made of. It isn't about the cement that holds the stones together or the organic matter that separates those particles. It's the actual voids, the space, the surfaces created in that matrix. And it's those voids, spaces and surfaces that govern the resilience and productivity of our soils. Okay, so the point we're making is it's about regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge, and through that process we can profoundly increase the resilience and productivity of those landscapes. And as we come back here, it's by rebuilding the Earth's soil carbon sponge that we can actually increase that productivity, but basically totally rehydrate the landscape to try to offset these dangerous hydrological climate extremes. We can see that in a more graphic way in terms of what's really quite common to most civil engineering, and we call this a hygrograph. And this simply measures flow over time. You see, and if we just say get 2 inches of rain, but we've got a hard surface, a compacted landscape like this, obviously we'll get a flood peak very rapidly going up, this massive flood peak. And of course that flood peak we know is obviously a flood. We know that it erodes. We know that it does damage. And we know that this costs massively, both in terms of infrastructure, because that's what so many of your rates and stuff go to. You know, where's all the stormwater control, etc., etc. And it also costs, of course, in the damage that it causes and in the erosion, right? Okay, and the damage. And of course, in the insurance. So basically what is happening is, yeah, we have flood peaks. We're going to get more extreme flood peaks. And basically, yeah, if we've got a hard, compacted soil surface like this, we're more or less going into that scenario. Basically, if we have that hard surface, we might have just a 0.5% carbon in the soil. So the amount of water that we're able to retain in that soil is very, very limited. Okay, we've just got this very limited amount of water that is actually able to be retained in that soil. Conversely, or not conversely, at the same time, the longevity of green growth, you know, the period over which, longevity of green, the period over which plants can grow on that soil is also very restricted. So by definition, a flood dictates the next drought. Okay, because that flood, water going off, doing all the damage, costing all this money, is dictating that within a matter of days you will be in drought. And in a sense, that's in a sense what we've done to our landscape. And conversely, we've got a different world, and we can draw that in green, can't we? Because if we take that same 2 inches of rain, but instead of having a 0.5, just say we have a 3% carbon soil, then we get a completely different flood peak, right? These are big. Okay, so then you'll get a hygrograph that might look something like this. Okay? I mean, I've drawn it a bit different because effectively you've got the same volume of water under the both curves. But see, what happens is, yeah, your runoff is this amount, you know, your flood runoff, but all this becomes available in-soil reservoir water, right? So these are your in-soil reservoirs. And again, in-soil reservoirs are resilience. You see, because now instead of having lost all that water in dangerous flood peaks, you're actually able to store that water. You also basically got a completely different issue as far as longevity of green. Because now, instead of being restricted to a few days, guaranteeing a drought after the flood, you're basically perpetuating extended green growth through that system. And of course, that's what productivity is all about. See, productivity is, yeah, sure, the area of green. It can be the rate of green. You know, we spend all our money on trying to grow things faster. And yeah, we might do 30% through genetic engineering, or, you know, all the inputs we play around with in the Green Revolution. 30% was a good target. But basically, by extending the longevity of green growth through these soil carbon sponges, we can give you 1,000% productivity dividend, 10 times the longevity of green. 100 days rather than 10 days of, you know, growth. And so the effects of these in-soil reservoirs in terms of floods, erosion, damage, resilience, but particularly costs can be immense. And so building these soil carbon sponges is profoundly valuable in actually sort of basically building resilient biosystems. And all we have to do is, we just have to grow, in a sense, plants into these systems to put the carbon in. So let's look at that, because we've sort of said why this is so important. You know, this is the whole climate scenario. We've talked about what the soil carbon sponge involves, this matrix, and in a sense what that represents in terms of landscape function and water retention. But I suppose the big issue now is, again, how. You know, how do we actually get soil carbon into our soils to regenerate these healthy soils to give us this resilience? And basically we can do that very simply. If we just look at a little diagram here, and we've got basically a plant with roots, and we'll just break it down to A, B, and C. Okay, because the how of building soil carbon is as simple as A, B, and C. And of course, A is all about agriculture. And in a sense, that's what we do so well, and that's in a sense what we will continue to do, and we must continue to do. And it's all about unashamedly maximizing green growth. Okay, so it's what really we've been in the business of with agriculture all along. How do we maximize the green growth, as we talked about here, particularly the longevity of green growth? And just as farmers have been doing, that's what we need to continue to do, maximize green growth. And of course, we live above the ground, and in a sense, that's been our major focus. You know, just how do we grow crops above the ground and look at the yield? Okay, so this is about yield. But what we tend to forget is that we only see some of that plant. We might see 30 to 40% of the plant above ground. There's another 30% here below ground in the roots, but actually unseen and basically unbeknown to many, there's another 30 to 40% going out into the soil as root exudates. Okay, these are sugars, amino acids, basically leaking out from plant roots. And of course, plants do this quite consciously, intelligently, because these plants are supporting vast networks of mycorrhizal fungi. 90% of plants in nature plus have these mycorrhizal associations. It goes back to our fungi when they first colonized soils, and these vast networks of fungal hyphae growing out throughout the soil, acting at this massive soil microbial root interface. Okay, and so in a sense, a healthy system has vast quantities of these networks into the soil. Basically, on a healthy soil, up to 25,000 kilometers of fungal hyphae per cubic meter of healthy soil. Twice the diameter of Earth, these mycelial tubes proliferating, growing throughout the soil, solubilizing nutrients, accessing nutrients, cycling nutrients. Okay, so this vast interface, and that's in a sense why the plant is supporting that, and there's very good reasons we'll come to in a second why they're doing that.
5 minutes before the break.
Sorry?
5 minutes to the break.
5 minutes to the break. Okay, right. Yes, good. Well, I had a break myself, so we'll give you 5 minutes extra. Okay, no, thank you. Thank you. Okay, and so what's important here is not just A, where we are looking at biomass, it's the BC ratios. You know, it's not what we grow, but what happens to every molecule of carbon that we grow. What happens to it? And there's only two things that can happen to it, B or C. It can either burn back into CO2 through fires or oxidation, or it can go into stable soil carbon. Okay? And so really it's this ratio of B and C. And that ratio is under our control through our land management. How do we manage our soil? Do we manage it so most of that carbon is burnt? And we can do that, if we wish to, by clearing, okay, by burning obviously, by cultivating excessively, by fertilizer, by biocides, and by fallowing, bare fallowing. And all of these processes, which we use to try and increase A, basically end up putting carbon back up into the air. And we're putting about 120% of A back up into the air through our current industrial agriculture, because we're not just burning most of the A, we're also burning heritage legacy carbon from that soil up into the air. You see? And so it's this basically oxidation of these processes that is turning up B. But instead, what we can do is we can say, look, how much of that carbon from A don't we put into the air, but can we put into stable soil carbon? We've already got 60% or so in the soil anyway. So can we make sure that this is basically staying in the soil? Turns into humates and turns into another compound called glomalin. And these are these carbon fungal byproducts that basically create the aggregate, that create the bed springs, that create healthy soils. Okay, so can we in a sense say, look, can we get most of our carbon, or a lot of that, at least 50%, back into this soil to rebuild the soil carbon sponge, and as we've seen diagrammatically, to build those bed springs. And that becomes a major challenge in agriculture. And we can do that simply by doing less of these. Okay, do we do less of these high input, because this is where all our costs are, input costs? Can we do less of that and more of this? Can we, in a sense, enhance the fungal activity and microbiology of these soils, okay, to put more into these humate and glomalin fractions? Okay, when we do that, when we put more into C, we end up with another factor, and we'll call that D. And this is really the profound point, because these then become positive feedback processes. Because for every gram of carbon that we put into C, every gram has 8 grams of extra water. Okay, so these are these positive multipliers. We've already seen here exactly how it works. By putting bed springs into this matrix, we can hold massive increases of extra water. For every gram of carbon we put into the soil, we can vastly increase the cation exchange capacity, or the nutrition of that soil. The biofertility, again, we've seen that here. These are these red surfaces. So by putting carbon into that soil, we can increase its nutrition. For every gram of carbon, we can massively increase its roots. And again, we've talked about that there. And every gram of carbon, we can increase its microbial activity. Okay? And so the whole basis of nature, the whole means by which nature creates highly productive ecosystems, even on very infertile soils, is through putting carbon in the soil to get these positive feedbacks, the dividends D. Okay? And so nature drives A, plant productivities, through D. Okay, so D drives A in nature. And we can too. We can design agricultural ecologies, land management systems that enhance carbon in the soil to give us these positive feedback dividend effect, to give us the resilience, to give us the productivity, and drive productivity as in nature through the efficiencies of these processes, these type of processes. But also, if we have these dividends D, we can negate the need for most of these inputs. We can massively reduce our reliance on these oxidative inputs, okay, to drive, and instead of having these B factors, by negating that, actually drive more carbon into the soil anyway. So again, we can have this very positive sequence. We can also actually, as in nature, we can do another very powerful thing. We can bring mobile biodigesters into these systems, because a lot of this biomass is often too dry to biodegrade into soil carbon. You know, it has to have a certain moisture. So nature, especially in seasonally dry, seasonally cold regions, sort of said, look, we can have these mobile biodigesters, and basically, because mobile, they had to move around. She didn't use wheels. She put things called legs on them, and basically they have an intake end and they have a business end, where basically these guys are taking litter, biomass, and turning it into stable soil carbon and biofertilizer. And so we can use ecological grazing animals, herbivores, intelligently to again drive carbon, to get these dividends, to drive productivities. So the whole point that we're talking here about dividends is really managing this natural growth of plants as nature did, basically to put carbon into these cathedrals, to build the water, the nutrition, the rootability, the microbial ecology, and basically giving us resilient, productive biosystems. Okay, look, let's take a break now, and then we'll come back after the break, and then we'll have questions, but also we can elaborate on some more of the details, technically, any things you got. Up to now, what we've been talking very much about are the building blocks, as we sort of said in the beginning, the why, what, and how of rebuilding resilience, rebuilding the Earth's soil carbon sponge, and in a sense, the tools, you know, the building blocks that we've got to do that. And of course, we want to have this discussion now, but also really just realize, how do we use those building blocks? How can we use this regeneration potential that nature's giving us to rebuild viability on farms, regionally, but then also do some very clever things like naturally, safely cooling the planet. Okay, and while that might be audacious, it's critical. We have to do that because, as we've said in the beginning, hey, we've got more than enough dangerous climate extremes coming, and it's really only cooling that can actually offset that warming risk that we face. But coming back to the beginning, we've got the capacity of how we can put carbon into the soil, and we've talked about by having to basically do less of B and more of C, we can reduce many of our input costs. But at the same time, we can sort of maximize still the productivity of A, because we're using D, these positive feedback dividends, to drive A. And our innovative leading farmers in Australia, but also globally, all around the world, they're proving that. They're getting 100% or so, plus or minus, the yields that they used to get under conventional agriculture. They're often getting much higher quality, much higher nutritional integrity in their food products, but they're doing it with less than 20% of the input costs. Because they've got the resilience of in-soil reservoirs and the sponge, they're doing it with less than 10% of the risk. They're doing it at a much higher level of reliability. They're getting, reliable yields 4 years out of 5 still, where their neighbours with high-risk input strategies are getting 2 years out of 5 because of the unreliable climate extremes. And they're often doing it with major improvements in the natural capital asset value of their land. And at the end of the day, of course, farmers are about the futures. Farmers are about leaving the land in a better condition than they got it, handing the land over to future generations so they can too have the water, the food, the habitat, the stability that we've enjoyed. So on-farm, major dividends. There's also major dividends regionally. What's happening now, because these farmers are growing more productive, higher nutritional crops, they're saying we want to move those crops into premium markets. We're no longer happy to just grow commodities and not just get the commodity prices, you know, the 6 cents in the dollars that in Australia farmers are getting for raw material commodities. I mean, farming used to be all about growing food for humanity. But in the last 60, 70 years, it seems to have been farming is about growing raw materials for industry at commodity grades, at commodity prices. And the question is, can we revitalize and can we revitalize farming at a regional level, at a community level, by moving up that value chain? And that's in a sense what people are doing. They're regenerating their soils, growing higher value, higher nutritional integrity crops, and then looking how do we take those direct to niche markets at premium prices. So these strategies open a lot of regional revitalization opportunities. Obviously those regional employment, value capture strategies employ people, and that has a major positive multiplier effect in that community. So it's a basis of revitalizing, you know, just the wider rural communities they work in. By regenerating our soil carbon sponge, we, however, also create enormous opportunities for doing something pretty profound, and that's naturally, safely cooling the planet. We've seen here that basically, yep, global warming is going up, that it might take 100 to 1,000 years to reduce, and in a sense, we haven't got that time. Dangerous climate extremes, hydrological extremes are impacting now, and so the question is, how do we reduce them? How do we buffer them? How do we avoid them? How do we survive them? And so it's again stepping outside our constraints. We've had this mentality from the models that it's CO2 that's the poison, the pollutant. No, CO2 is a symptom, it's a resource to rebuild healthy soils. But if the real problem is global warming, what can we do to address it directly? We have, in a sense, the blue planet, and every day, continually, we have 342 watts per square metre of incident solar radiation coming into the top of the troposphere. And of course, in a balanced climate, 342 watts per square metre would be leaving the planet to keep that Earth stable. But it's no longer doing that. We've got 339 watts per square metre leaving the planet because some 3 watts per square metre is being retained by the Earth because of this enhanced abnormal greenhouse effect. But what this tells us is that, yeah, we have to cool this planet 3 watts per square metre, which is less than 1% of the incident solar radiation. And the question is, how does nature naturally cool the planet? And is 3 watts per square metre cooling feasible through regenerating natural systems? And the beautiful thing is when we start thinking beyond that CO2 limitation that we've all got into, we can sort of say, okay, what is it that we can do to use these systems to naturally cool the planet? If we have, again, we start off with the sponge. Okay, and we basically have a soil surface and we have plants growing on that soil surface. Those plants will be transpiring water vapor into the air as part of their transpiration stream. And to turn 1 gram of liquid water into water vapor takes 590 calories per gram of energy that has to come from the surface to turn that liquid into gas. That's the latent heat of vaporization, just simple physical reality. And of course that means that this surface has to cool 590 calories for every gram of water that's transpired or evaporated. Okay, so we have this natural hydrological cooling. I should have drawn that in blue to make it more pronounced. Cool. Okay, let's write it again. Okay, so this surface, that land system has to cool. And we know that when we go under green, moist, transpiring woodland, it's cooler. You know, where I live in the summer, 10 degrees centigrade cooler compared to adjacent cleared bare land in a summer's day. Okay, and so these latent heat fluxes, these latent heat fluxes basically take 85 watts per square meter from the Earth's surface back out to space in that natural climate model, right? So of the 342 watts coming in, nature, 24% of that incident solar radiation is transpired and evaporated from the Earth's moisture back up into the upper atmosphere and then dissipates out to space. 85 watts. We have a cooling requirement, as we said there, of 3 watts per square meter. So it goes to reason that a 4% increase in terrestrial transpiration and evaporation would, in a sense, offset that 3 watts per square meter. So the question is to you, you're supposed to be asking the question, I'm asking you the question, is it feasible to rebuild the sponge, to rebuild these hydrological cooling processes to cool the planet 3 watts per square meter?
Sorry, I have a question about that specific thing, because you're losing heat from the ground.
Yes.
But when that vapor comes down as rain, it's presumably the reverse process.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. When that, we drew it in black, when that water condenses back as haze droplets up in the upper atmosphere, that 590 calories is released, per gram is released, but up here, most of that dissipates out to space. Okay, because it's taken from the surface up into the upper atmosphere, where it's so much thinner, the gas concentration, and most of this heat.
It doesn't just get trapped there by the cloud.
It can do. Okay, look, let me explain. We're going through, the world's hydrological dynamics is complicated. There's, in a sense, 10 processes and stages involved, and I'm explaining them, but certainly, yes, clouds, rainfall, they all become part of that cycle, but we'll explain, all right? It'll come out in the explanation. So the point is, as the question validly says, yes, here is a process, and the answer is, can we cool the planet? Yes, we can, right? There's another one of these processes. We drew these little haze droplets when they go back into, the water goes back into liquid haze droplets, and those haze droplets form these things called clouds. Okay? And clouds, dense high albedo clouds, reflect 120 watts per square meter back out to space. About a third of the incident solar radiation coming into the planet is naturally reflected back out to space before it even reaches the surface by clouds, these dense high albedo clouds. They cover about 50% of the planet at any one time. And again, the analogy is, if we can increase these clouds 2%, can we offset 3 watts per square meter, the 3 watts per square meter warming that we have? Okay, so these are all opportunities to say, okay, what are the hydrological processes in nature that naturally cool, and to what extent do we influence and can we influence them? And the answer that we're really giving is that yes, we can, but only if we have a soil carbon sponge, because they all depend on this hydrological cycle driven by the sponge. Because if we don't have the sponge, we have a bare surface, and then we don't have this transpiration opportunity. That really, in a sense, brings us to the third of these processes, and again, they all connect, but we're drawing them separately. Okay, if we have here a vegetation surface, as we sort of said, that's cooling with its sponge. These surfaces, sure, sunlight comes in there, but it's protected by the albedo. It's got these latent heat fluxes cooling it, and they very rarely get above 20 degrees centigrade, these surfaces, right? I mean, a cool, vegetated, protected soil rarely gets above 20 degrees. Mostly it's 18 degrees centigrade. By contrast, in the same climate, if we just have a bare, hard, fallowed surface, then basically we have incident solar radiation, and that basically is heating up this surface, and this surface can get up to 60 degrees centigrade. In Australia, so hot that, quite frankly, you can't walk on it comfortably. And we know that from asphalt and what have you. But there's a fundamental law of physics. It's a Stefan Boltzmann equation. I mean, the Earth is a black body radiator. It's like a stove. It will re-radiate the heat that absorbs. If it absorbs a lot of heat, it will re-radiate a lot of heat as infrared. Obviously, I've got the wrong color, as infrared long wave radiation heat. And there's an equation that basically gives you that amount of heat that's re-radiated, which is basically the amount of re-radiation is proportional, a constant, to the fourth power of the temperature in degrees Kelvin. And I mean, you don't have to go to the physics of it, but what it means is that the amount of heat being re-radiated is the fourth power of the temperature. So the difference in temperature of these surfaces vastly increases the amount of heat that's re-radiated. Temperature times temperature times temperature times temperature. Okay? So the amount of heat going up is enormously increased. And see, the key factor driving the greenhouse isn't the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's the amount of heat being re-radiated that is available for first water vapor molecules and then CO2 to absorb. So effectively, we can turn down the greenhouse effect by keeping surfaces cool and moist, rather than letting them heat up as bare, exposed surfaces, vastly increasing the radiation. Okay, so what we've in a sense here outlined are three key areas where we, through land management, have a profound capacity to cool the Earth naturally and safely. But also we can do this cooling within days. You know that when you've got a moist surface, moist cool surface with a sponge, it's cooler within days compared to being out there. I mean, you just walk across there immediately and you've got the difference. Okay, rehydrate that surface, protect that surface, and you really massively reduce its re-radiation. Coming to your point though, obviously all this stuff depends on, have we got water for the sponge? Is there the rainfall from these clouds? Do these clouds give us enough rain to actually create and refill that sponge? And there is no question that we have to close that hydrological cycle. So we have to take these clouds and we have to turn them into raindrops. It takes about 1 million cloud microdroplets to make a raindrop. Okay? And 3 things enable raindrops to form. They're called precipitation nuclei. Okay? And these are the materials that are needed to coalesce 1 million of these cloud droplets into a raindrop that's large and heavy enough to fall out under gravity. And the 3 precipitation nuclei that cause rain, all of Earth rain, include ice crystals, and we get that in high latitudes, and as we go up mountains, high altitudes where ice forms, and of course ice will crystallize, or ice will coalesce and condense water on it to make bigger and bigger raindrops, and so a lot of the high latitude, high altitude rain is caused by ice crystals. The other ones are salts, and again over the oceans we've got ocean spray putting sodium chloride in the air, and again you'll get ocean clouds formed and rain formed with the hygroscopic coalescence of these cloud droplets into raindrops. But by far the most important, particularly in tropical areas and inland areas, are a group of bacteria. And these were discovered by Louis Pasteur in the 1870s. He called them Aerobacter orogenes. Aerobacter is logical enough. Orogenes in Greek means I don't know what they're doing there. But he's a good scientist because he called it for what it was. The point is, these bacteria are by far the most effective in cloud chamber work that we did in CSIRO atmospheric physics at coalescing haze droplets, cloud droplets into raindrop. They're some of the most hygroscopic, that's sucking substances we know in nature, and they're extremely effective in actually bringing haze droplets into raindrops. These bacteria are produced in the stomatal cavities of trees, some trees, certain forests. There's a lot we don't know about them. When, where, what, how, all that stuff. But basically we know that they're produced. We've got radio label studies in the Amazon. They produce about 50% of the rainfall, at least 50% of the rainfall in those systems. And these hygroscopic bacteria are being produced, and of course coalescing these haze humidity droplets and bringing that rain back every afternoon as rain. Okay, so we know that vegetation needs rain. We're now putting the proposition, does rain need vegetation? Certainly rain needs precipitation nuclei. So again, as we rebuild our sponge, as we rebuild resilient in-soil reservoirs, longevity of green, healthy biosystems, as we build this drawdown capacity, the biosystems again, can we restore some of these rainfalls? The evidence is clear from field studies, yes we can. Certainly nature does. There's a lot we don't know about the details, but the experience, the evidence from sites is yes we can. So again, profoundly, by stepping outside of this, black hole of CO2 greenhouse where we really hit the end that no, we can't change the climate just through managing carbon, just through drawing down carbon, even negative carbon. We can't avoid the dangerous climate extremes, but if we step into the hydrological opportunities created by the sponge, yes, we can cool the planet to 3 watts per square metre. We can offset the dangerous warming effects. We can buffer. We can avoid. We can survive these extremes. And again, there's another whole dimension that nature gives us to naturally, safely cool the planet. But with that, look, can we have questions? And hopefully I've been a bit provocative, but I'm very keen to do what I can to answer them.
I just wondered if you could say a little bit about where you think we are with, or where you think governments, industry and financial interests are with this. because it was very elegantly explained what you've just been describing, and
Yeah.
I could imagine there could be some.
Okay, the question is, where are we with governments, industry, finance, with this whole understanding, and in a sense, partly why have we, ignored it, and in a sense, what's needed to take it forward? Is that a fair comment? And the point is that, and this is in a sense the point of the last 2 months, and we've just been talking to farmers, we talked to policy people, we talked to the finance people, we were in Chicago talking to, the investment community. And as a general rule, they don't have any problems or any questions or any difficulty about with the simple natural logic that we've outlined. They get it. Okay? But the simple issue is that, look, up to now, we've spent $60 billion on this, this mindset of saying, hey, we have global warming, it's caused by fossil fuels emissions, we've got to reduce fossil fuel emissions, and somewhere in 2100, if the scenarios are right, or if we even can understand it, we'll have to do something about it. So politics has just been about expediency, as it always is, kicking the can down the road, saying this is too difficult to address. And quite frankly, up to now, we haven't had this simple, natural, safe, hydrological explanation and solution. So when we're talking about, fresh ideas and being on the edge, in a sense, we're provoking this narrative. Progressively, they're starting to talk about this, so I have no hesitation, whereas before they just ignored it, then they tried for a while to rubbish it, but as always, they will now be appropriating it, right? So in a sense, we're winning, but it's comfort. But the point is, it's not good enough, because the issue really isn't politicians or finance. The issue is grassroots empowerment, because it's what we do every garden, every acre, every region, to rebuild that sponge, to rebuild the hydrology, to rebuild the resilience. We've got 10 years, so, by all means, let's just do it, but I'm absolutely assured the politics, finance, etc. will follow. Talking to the finance people, they are living in a big Ponzi scheme, a big bubble. They know it better than most. And the question is, where do they invest to get security long term? And up to now, they've never had the clear indications, but no, they're asking us questions of, okay, what are the metrics? What are the performance measures, and how do I look at my portfolio from a risk minimization, natural capital maximization, debt equity sort of issue? So no, they'll come along, and when they do, it'll be significant. The only question is, are we doing it on the grass level fast enough?
Can I ask you to...
Not you can't. Get on the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Oh dear. Can I ask you to talk a little bit about your mobile biodigesters? And the question that... sorry, I'm waffling now. Methane.
Yes, methane.
Okay, because there was yet another article in The Guardian sort of advocating that we should decline from eating meat.
Yes.
Can I just throw in my sort of thing? What we've got to decline from doing is supporting industrial farming. And any kind of farming is quite good if it's done in some kind of harmony with nature.
Okay, absolutely. Look, critical question. It comes to your question too, but it comes to the whole reality that we're in, the context we're in, and how science and politics defines problems and then gets the wrong answers because the context they set. Okay, you've all heard the message, hey, cows emit methane. Well, guess what? Everybody with a gut emits methane, right? So basically any anaerobic digestion system has some methane emissions. But absolutely right. So we have the first thing, context one, cows give off methane. And that's a fact, right? No question, that's a fact, and we're not even trying to dispute that. there's another bigger context that we can define, though, because if we define the context in a new paradigm, too, you say, what is the natural systems where cows live? And cows manage pastures. Okay? It's cows grazing pastures that keeps that grass from going over mature, rank, dead, and burning. And burning, of course, we've already recognized is not a good thing. So cows are managing green pastures. Okay? And green pastures, we've already agreed, they transpire, right? And when basically sunlight heats water vapor molecules that have been going up, they photo-oxidize those water volume molecules. So we go from water, goes to hydroxyl ions, plus hydrogen ions, which forms bicarbonate ions, right? But it's the hydroxyl ions that matter. Okay, so a green pasture transpiring moisture, provided it's got a sponge, but we've talked about the sponge that cows provide, it will basically produce about 100 times the hydroxyl ions per acre compared to the methane produced by the cows maintaining that pasture. Okay, so the photo-oxidation of water on green pastures has 100 times the methane photo-oxidation capacity compared to the methane produced by the cattle grazing it or producing it. And it's for that very reason that methane, all throughout history, recent history, been about 700 parts per billion. Okay? And it's been 700 parts per million for a million years, despite there being many, many times the herbivores grazing these green pastures. So if we change the context, yes, cows emit methane, but also cows create the natural ecology, the photo-oxidation that oxidizes that methane, removes it from the air, and has maintained that natural methane level at 700 parts per billion. So in a sense, if we define this issue as context number 2, there's no problems. Well, actually, it's real positive because we'll be paying for the methane our cows emit, and we'll be sending invoices to whoever makes that claim for the photo-oxidation service, the cows, and you'll be 100 to 1 in front. Stands to logic, doesn't it? But there's a more powerful context actually that comes into this, and we'll do that 3 in blue. Because there is a major methane problem on the planet. Okay? There's about 15,000 billion tons of methane locked up in methane hydrates on the continental shelves. This is methane effectively as ice crystals, and as the oceans warm, basically a lot of that is already being releasing. If we get a massive release of that methane, it's game over, higher life. It's happened previously, it's an extinction event. There's about 5,000 billion tons of carbon as methane, potentially methane in tundras, and again, as those tundras warm, then that methane again creates an extinction risk. And the only thing that is going to save the Earth potentially from one of these methane burps or one of these mass methane extinction events, the only thing that can save the Earth is, have we got enough green, actively transpiring pastures at higher latitude, maintained by caribou, reindeer, herbivores, to give you enough of this photo-oxidation to neutralize that extinction risk. So we have an extinction risk. And the question is, have we got enough hydroxyl radicals from these pastures to neutralize it?
Question coming here. Sorry, it's just that one. It's that just following on from what you're saying. 'Cause if that pasture was woodland,
Yes.
would that actually be better?
Okay, thank you. obviously the photooxidation happens from transpiration from woodland as well, but basically the role of pastures in creating stable soil carbon, maintaining the sponge, and maintaining that whole, hydrological flux, especially in higher latitudes where it's often seasonally so cold and frosted. No, the grasslands are probably, woodlands are playing a role there as well. I'm not excluding them, and I'm not taking all, I don't think these grasslands have to take all the credit. Nature doesn't work like that. But certainly it's those vast areas of grasslands that are our only buffer against this extinction risk. Okay? And really it's, the point I'm trying to make is we define context, 1, 2, or 3. And we define problems always in our simplistic, politically industrial expedient terms. And of course we ignore all these other contexts. You change the context and you completely change the response, the logic, the potentials. The question was, of course, we don't need to feed, we mustn't feed animals on grain. They eat grass. So this idea that we're growing animals in factories and sheds away from their natural habitats is abhorrent anyway, but it's abhorrent for health reason. You don't want to eat those animals. There's a whole lot of other reasons why you don't. So we shouldn't be doing that from animal rights or from our human health point of view. Okay, but certainly this whole victimization of herbivores for methane is a complete furphy. And we'll be sending them the invoice if they try to charge you for it.
So we're facing a local extinguishing the lights event in about 2 minutes. We've got one more question.
Okay, so apologise.
And then we'll have to come to a close.
Thanks very much. I think you touched on the crux of this problem was when you spoke about getting farmers to give up the burning and go to the dividends.
Yeah.
By promoting their produce as a niche product.
Yep.
The argument that we would face in trying to do that is that we'll never have enough food to feed everybody from that niche market. And so we need some really good incentive to encourage farmers to give up their intensive methods and move to something that is more holistic, more agro.
Yeah.
And the argument that I always fire at that is that we could do that very easily if we didn't throw away between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the food we produce. Is anybody out there that, in your discussion, is anybody else making that point?
Well, look, and yes, I fully support that point, and I make that point exactly that in 2008 we had the food crisis. In 2008 we grew enough food to feed 12 billion people. 2008. Yes, we waste half of our food, in terms of the production process, and basically we use half of the grains that we produce to feed animals, grain, in these, factory farms where the animals should be out in the pasture. Okay, so we have got extremely wasteful, inefficient, illogical, unethical processes. The other thing about feeding the world, it's very simple. 70% of humanity will live in urban, concentrations, and it's urban agriculture. It's a capacity for people to grow food locally from the nutrients that are actually going and concentrating in cities. We won't have time to talk about all that, but that's going to be a key part of their whole nutritional health in the future. We certainly can grow grain productively with minimal inputs. That's what Australia's been doing, and certainly all over the world. Yes, we can do that. Farmers can do that viably. Certainly we can grow high quality grass-fed protein on the 4 or 5 billion hectares of grazing grasslands on this planet. So the answer, the food story is, it's really, as you said, it's the equity, the affordability, the distribution of that food, not wasting it. From a farmer's point of view, it is actually saying, yes, how do you use these lower input, more productive, more resilient systems, but get out of that commodity trap so that you are getting a fair price for that food to make it viable. lots of detail and discussion there, but basically they're the two front lines I see it.
So we've got one final last question.
Thanks. I just wondered if you could speak to our local context here, because we live in a landscape where grazing animals dominate the agriculture. And I'd like to hear what you think about the state of the carbon sponge in our what's generally a set stocking system that we see here.
No, look, thank you very much, and it's a critical question, and of course I don't want to be here from outside telling you what to do in your space, but from what I've seen is, yes, you've got beautiful picturesque countryside, beautiful stone fences, 10 centimetre high, you know, grasses, and as you say, they've been set stock, continually grazed for 2,000 years since the Roman times. Your root systems probably don't go much below 6 inches, 15 centimetres. So you're, in a sense, growing this whole biosystem on a very, very vulnerable, fragile, brittle green veneer. Okay, this landscape originally, if you go back 4,000 years ago, would have been regenerated, as all the glaciated countries were, by these tall blue stem prairie grasses that we see still in the US and Canada. You know, these tall, deep-rooted grasses putting massive amounts of carbon into the soil with root-shoot ratios of 10 to 1. 10 grams of carbon into the root exudates and the roots compared to 1 above ground. And why? Because it was all about building that deep, resilient sponge. So nature's evolutionary advantage was building soil natural capital. And I would argue that, yes, this whole beautiful countryside, you've got an urgent need to look at resilience, look at that resilience equation for your lands, and say, how do I basically build system that can withstand not a 3-day or a 3-week drought, but a 6-month drought? Where's your water going to come from? You know, are you going to have in-soil reservoirs, water stores, longevity of green, buffering resilience? So yes, as quickly as possible, do you use these native grasses? You may have a lot of them here in vestigial areas, deep-rooted perennial native grasses, and then intelligent ecological grazing strategies to actually lift the productivity and resilience of those pastures that you talked about. And I think it's a very important, critical issue, and it's essential to maintain the viability of these systems.
I'm not aware that they do a sleeper service here at Reged, so we do need to start to come to a close. And we'll be around for a while after the session closes, but I think Reged will close the doors at about 9:30. So I'd just like to thank Walter for being here. We'll keep all this artwork. I'm going to ask him to sign and date all the information. If you want to come and sign it, put your name on it, we was here, I'd be more than happy to have that little icon on these pieces of paper. But Walter, thank you.
And I'd like to very much thank you, because it's discussions with the grassroots, with the regional, committed individuals, the innovators, that really is the whole future. So thank you.
So for those of you who did fill in the little paperwork outside, I got the duty manager to do a mental raffle, and it's number 8, Georgina Wingfield Hayes. And what I'm going to suggest you do, is it Georgina? Oh, it's that Georgina. What I suggest you do, Georgina, is get Walter to sign it with one of his big pens, because if you notice, he's become quite warlike in terms of his green paint on his face. Georgina, it's here for you. So, as I said earlier, there you go. Now, it was the first potato starch DVD case ever produced in the British Isles when we did that, so enjoy it. Once you've read it or watched it, eat it. So, as I said, this is the first, and what we've agreed with Reged is we're going to aim to run a 2-monthly frequency, and the broadcast, so the recording of tonight, will be held back. It won't go public for 2 months. But what we're aiming to do is stretch into our network. And you may see some faces on the photograph here that are in the room this evening. But I also want to bring Sheila, my wife, into this conversation. She can't be here because her parents are critically ill in the USA. So we're imagining a regenerative layer. And we're going to call upon the networks that we're associated with. There's the orange dots, the accredited hubs. We're the accredited hub for the British Isles, for the Savory Institute. But through those networks, and hopefully through everyone in this room, we're going to reach out to stimulate a conversation that will build off the video from this evening. And I invite you all just to stay in contact with us, and we'll publish the date on that. And just to close this first evening, I'd like Walter just to read this little quote out, because I believe this reflects what we're here to do in this room.
Thus the task is not so much to see what no one yet has seen, but to think what nobody has yet thought about, that which everybody sees.
Thank you. Go home.